This is the Fantasy Sanctuary, and it is a special Friday crossover edition with Rotoviz's own Colm Kelly. This is the unofficial home of Draftkings Best Ball in England. This is another great day at Best Ball, so let's get into it. Yes, that is right. We are back for another Draftkings Best Ball draft. We keep rotating between Rotoviz's channel and here in the Fantasy Sanctuary. Today we'll be drafting in the Draftkings Milly Maker, so be ready if you want to draft along with us. But before that, Colm, I want to talk about hero running backs. I want to talk about which ones give us the starts that we feel the most confident in, not just which player we have the most confidence in, because it's very easy to just say, okay, well, Christian McCaffrey is the one who I feel the best about. But when we look at these first few rounds using the ADP grids from Fantasy Life, in terms of it, do you feel like getting the initial start with Christian McCaffrey and looking at these kind of players to start your hero RB build, do you feel like that's a lot better than any of the others? Like, how good do you feel about these hero RB builds at the 101 or 102 spot?
So you've started off in a different direction. I thought you were just going to ask me which way to go. What I will say is it's important, and this is one of my favorite things to talk about, is drafting from back to front. And, you know, obviously, depending on how we start these opening 4 rounds is going to affect how the entire team looks. But there's such emphasis put on the early picks and how your team looks after 4 rounds, 6 rounds, 8 rounds. And we'll talk about as we go through this draft, you know, trying to have a certain amount of wide receivers after a certain amount of rounds and where we want to get those players. But it's also the possible value of building out the back end of your team as well. So if you have skip a Christian McCaffrey, what have you got to do to you won't be able to replicate that, but to patch together a room of sorts that can still help you compete in these tournaments. So that is the biggest part when I'm looking at these, is what is the cost, and then what is it impacting the rest of your roster? And the other part to figure into that is, you know, you take Christian McCaffrey, well, likely then, if you're trying to do a hero RB build, you're not going to take Achan based on how ADP filters out here. But you could take potentially a Jalen Waddle if he falls 2 picks, for example, and then a Devontae Smith or a Malik Neighbors. Then you're starting to get into a really nice territory. But again, then you're skipping on the 2 running back options that are highlighted here in Jacobs and Pacheco. So there's a couple of things looking at this is, how do players fall in that draft? Do you get some of your prime targets? Or is it a case then, if you take a Christian McCaffrey, that when you're in round 2, let's say Devontae Smith and Neighbors go early, and then you're in a situation where it's like Achan and Williams are the prime options, and then if a wide receiver goes again over the course of the next round and a half, are you staring down, you know, 3 running backs through 4 rounds? And that's where the tricky part comes in. The part that I would say with these specific players is, I do think you can set up a team with Christian McCaffrey, for example, as you mentioned. But I really do feel that the players that you can add to the rosters with the running backs at the back of the draft, that we'll probably talk about in a moment, I think they will set you up with a lot, based on how ADP is settled at the moment, a lot better rosters. But that also, can the other running backs outscore a Christian McCaffrey is the tricky part. Can they be, I guess, the hero, as we want to call it?
Yeah, and so, I mean, let's look at the next tier of running backs, because the reason I wanted to talk about this is I've been looking at drafts I've been doing and looking. I haven't had many 101s. I don't think anyone in the whole best ball industry has had more than one 101 across the whole of drafting season.
We did have one Christian McCaffrey team, though, I believe. I think we were the 102 last time.
Yeah. Exactly. And then I did a underdog draft with Tyler where we were in the puppy superflex, and of course we got the 101 there. But yeah, so basically when I've done hero RB starts with Bijan or Brees, and I've got Brandon Ayuk, Chris Olave, Nico Collins, Deebo Samuel, Jalen Waddle as my wide receiver ones, I felt better about that kind of combined start rather than ending up with Mike Evans or Devonta Smith as my wide receiver one. So it was kind of this stretch which really opened it up to me. If you were going with Bijan or Brees, is there a particular cluster of these wide receivers where you're just auto-clicking them to add to this? Or do you feel like there's more value in looking at like Sam Laporta, Travis Kelce, Lamar Jackson, the quarterbacks, and building slightly different? Or do you feel like you have to catch up with this cluster of wide receivers in the middle?
Again, it depends on if players arrive at that spot of the draft and allow you to draft those wide receivers. Like if, let's say, Malik Neighbors somehow falls into the middle of round 3 and it's him versus Sam Laporta, that's a conversation for me, like with the options like a DK Metcalf, DJ Moore, Stephon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, Michael Pittman. I would be taking Sam Laporta over all of those. And your boy Zay Flowers, who's going just after those kind of names that I mentioned, like he would be, for me, a name that would be going in there ahead of, for example, a Pittman if I'm drafting. So based on the tiers of players that are available, I really feel like once you take that running back at that point, let's say a Bijan or a Brees, I'm not going back in for a Barkley or an Etienne. I'm staying away, and I'm going to target mainly wide receiver, but the elite tight ends as well. And I'm less likely at the moment, I feel, to be going for the elite quarterbacks, so the likes of a Lamar Jackson or the other names that'll be going to Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts. I'm much more likely to be wide receiver and tight end focused through those rounds. But I think, again, going back to what I mentioned a moment ago, it's really the combination of the players at ADP that you can put together through those 4 rounds. So if you can have, let's say, just either 3 wide receivers, a running back, or else 2 wide receivers, a tight end, and a running back. But I think in this range from spot 6 through to 12, I do like what you can kind of do from that 7th spot a lot of the time, because it's meaning that sometimes an Olave might fall to you or a London might fall to you. Whereas when you're at, let's say, spot 6, you're really having to start to reach for, let's say, Jalen Waddle at that point, or maybe even getting into Neighbors or Smith, which you're not really getting the advantage of ADP there. Whereas when you're, again, back at 6 or 7, sometimes those players might sneak their way back into your roster with a bit of ADP value.
Yeah, okay, I agree with you. I think there's obviously so many drafts are different. I just feel like what I'm more confident in is these teams when I get them, probably because the middle of drafts, it's kind of easier to build around. You get much more falling to you than when you're stuck at the 1-on-1.
Exactly. That's exactly it. If you're at the turns, those first 3 picks at either side, it does put that little bit of a pressure on you, because you're not really going to do it at the 202, but the players that go between 202 and then the second last pick of the 3rd round, there's a lot of names in there. And if you want to get them, and let's say Drake London went where Jamar Gibbs went, and somehow Breece Hall had fallen to 11, you may in that instance want to be a little bit different and take those 2 players potentially together. But realistically, there's a lot of players in that range that you're just not going to get. And that means that sometimes you are going to have to reach the opposite way that you want to, rather than players falling to you.
Yeah. We are going to get into a draft in a minute, but first, shout out to everyone in the chat. Phil, week off work, joining us live for once. Bindles in his busy grind of catching every best ball stream around the industry. Shout out Ben. Index of Suspicion saying fresh cuts for the start of Euros. Aye, lads. Well, honestly,
this was a rushed one. This is like only 15 minutes old. I think I did this myself before the show, so nice and short.
I'm not sure I could even tell you who is playing in the Euros. I believe it starts today, but yeah. Just one last question before we get into the draft, though. When we look at round 2, so I've been saying that I feel more confident about the round war on running backs in Hero RB builds from like the Bijan Brees perspective because of the wide receiver 1 it gives me. But is there any running back in round 2 or even round 3 that you feel confident about starting with a Hero RB build that you still feel outweighs what I'm saying because you've got the round 1 wide receiver?
The only one, so for me, like if Gibbs is in the start of the 2nd round, he would potentially become that option. I think at 12, if that's the case, I probably would be making a skip there. But the likes of him or an Achane, there is obviously some concern around Achane, can he stay healthy and the competition in the backfield, but that offense, again, I'm trying to play that through the later guys like a Mostert, for example. But I feel like in a PPR format like this, the upside for Gibbs is just huge heading into his 2nd year. But the downside is we have seen Montgomery be able to, take a good chunk of the work as well. And obviously that offense is getting more and more crowded. And, for them all to put up huge numbers is going to get a little bit tricky. But if he takes a step forward and he, is getting the work in the PPR game, he could rival those other 3 names going before him as the running back 1 in PPR. Tom has muted himself. He was so impressed with the Gibbs love.
At a certain point, I've just got to shut myself up. But let's get into a draft and see whether we fall into one of those spots where we might want to consider a hero RB build. Set at 8 out of 12. This is the Draftkings Milly Maker, $20 entrance fee, 150 entry max per person, 1.5 million up top, and I believe 6 figures for everybody coming inside the top 10. So plenty of money on the line. Index of suspicion says Germany v Scotland today. I'm sure that'll be a good match.
Kai Havertz scores again. I'm an Arsenal fan, so I'm a big Kai Havertz fan at the moment.
So I don't know who that is, but we draw the 112, which means potentially we could look at a Jahmyr Gibbs hero RB start. I broke down a team last week on our channel where I started Jahmyr Gibbs and eventually ended up falling into a Ravens and Brock Purdy stack, meaning I only had a couple of wide receivers through the first 6 rounds, but I was scooping ADP value and it felt quite difficult. Go and check that video out after this one because I felt like I kind of rescued it in the end, but it was definitely tricky. A couple of people are recognized in this draft board, though. Ben Heyman drafting out of 104, Phil Riverman himself at the 108. If you are in here and I haven't mentioned you, do let us know. Look, I am trying not to make every draft on this channel a Ravens stack, but guests keep coming on and guests keep telling me to take the Ravens. So, yeah, it's tricky. There we go. Ben saying he is drafting in the 4 spot. Colm, how are you feeling about the 12 spot and the teams that you've been drafting from there at this point in the offseason?
I'm looking forward to it. I like the challenge of, how to build teams that could catch up with those people with what we would call the favorited picks as the 1, 2, 3 picks. And can you do something at the back end of drafts that can make you catch up with them? Like I mentioned, starting RB is not something that I would usually try to do, but when you're at the back end of drafts, like chasing, if all the wide receivers have gone, chasing additional wide receivers, sometimes if the targets that you would like to get are not available, is not the way to go. We've done a lot of super flex drafts recently over on Rotoviz Overtime and, doing 0 quarterback drafts and some different fun things like that. But, will it end up just being a dead team? There's a possibility, but with the ways you can create edges at other positions can help you head on and possibly overtake those teams at the top end. So I'm looking forward to seeing how it rolls here and how it falls. And, yeah, we'll just see again what players are available. The good thing, Tom, with the 112, it can be tricky while doing a stream or drafting with somebody else because it's a quick turnaround from one player to the next, especially if the targets that you're looking at go off the board in a couple of picks before you. But the other good part of it is that people can't snipe you when you're talking about players in between picks. So there's positives and negatives. So yeah, I'm probably not going to lean into an RB start, but again, like you can never say never in situations like what happens if Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson make it to the turn. Let's will that into existence.
Yeah, and we've got Phil drafting at the 108 and then Starkindler drafting out the 109. So not right on our heels, but close enough where we at least want to be slightly wary of him. Shout
We
out
got
to
the
David.
Jason logo there for Starkindler.
Yeah, so I think we can just pencil in a wide receiver nice and early for Starkindler most of the time when they're going to be near to us. Phil takes Breece Hall after Bijan Robinson. These first 8 picks just feel pretty set. Sometimes you see him on St. Brown, Justin Jefferson kind of skipping. Yeah. And of course, CeeDee Lamb did go before Christian McCaffrey in this one. So yeah, we are 2 picks away. Shout out to 2 accents. How will people survive? Yep, this is our favorite European crossover best ball show. Where else are you getting accents like that? So we are 1 pick away. Puka Nacua, Jahmyr Gibbs, Drake London, Marvin Harrison. Jahmyr Gibbs does go before us. It feels like, well, this is a double wide receiver selection, and I'd be fine taking Puka as one of those falling 3 spots.
Yeah, I think we have to take Puka. We haven't drafted him together yet, and I haven't drafted a lot of them so far this offseason. He has to be the first pick, and my advice in these drafts is to let the ticks go down on to talk it through. But London would be my selection here in general. Olave would be probably the next player I would look at. Have you a preference out of those two? I know we've drafted London quite a few times together.
No, I like that. And I mean, so I use Spike Week's tools, which tell me the combinations I've got of each player with the players I've already drafted. So you can see these zeros here. I haven't drafted Puka Nakua with Chris Olave at all. So even though I'd like Drake London more, I'm quite okay starting with Chris Olave because I think that's quite fun. I think it'll lead to some interesting selections down the road. But yeah, if you want these Spike Week tools, hit the join button down below and you can get up to 40% off everything on Spike Week's website. Track your exposures, your combinations of players, everything like that, and much more. So yeah, so nothing too crazy from the first round. I was a little surprised Jahmyr Gibbs went before us because sometimes I've seen him slip as far as the 202. I haven't seen many people kind of grabbing him early.
I feel with Gibbs that he could next season, be in the point, where we're drafting him at the 103 or 104, and especially if it's a case that, anything happens with Montgomery or he's not available heading into next season, for example. But the one thing I would mention is, if he is going, let's say where Kyron's going, it is only like a 5-pick difference, or going where Barkley's going. It is a very different picture in my mind than when he's going at the 112, because the growth there, you're obviously going to get a running back who would be a hero running back and then would be returning huge on that first round pick. But the other part is, he's not jumping a huge amount in terms of we're drafting him kind of at the height of that expectation, even though I'm bullish on him. First round value is still there. I think in that situation, we had to take Puka because of the drop back, as you mentioned. I think a lot of people listening probably would be wondering the Olave over London pick. I have them both right beside each other in the same tier. And, sometimes when you're drafting, it is as much as Tom said there, getting different exposures and different drafts. We have drafted now, I think maybe 4 or 5 times together this offseason. And I think every single time we have drafted Drake London. So we need to jump in. I didn't see that comment when I was talking. What was it?
Colm always drafting with next year's value in mind. Rotoviz till the end.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say, I mentioned drafting back to front. I talk about that quite a bit and knowing what options are going to be available later. Like being comfortable with the running back runner or the wide receiver start there, because the options that are going to be available in the 7th through 11th round are going to be running back selections most likely for us. But the drafting with next year in mind, I always plug this as a Sean Siegel and Ben Gretsch, side of things, but they draft next year's first and second round, or probably coming up soon here every season. And if you come into that mindset of like when you're drafting a player, like let's say you start to look at some of these names, Mike Evans, Devontae Adams. Mike Evans is the player who's always going to prove me wrong and continue to have success no matter what age he is. But like if you're looking at the players at the back end of the round to draft, like who is most likely to be moving up in ADP next year? Is it Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith, or is it Devontae Adams and Mike Evans? And that'll become more clear throughout the draft. But looking at trying to picture next year's ADP, I think is a huge mindset to shift into to help you draft these particular names.
Yeah, and I definitely like that point. Question from Phil in the chat, who is sitting at the 108 with Breece Hall and Nico Collins. Did you consider Harrison for Puka, Harrison correlation? I mean, I don't mind that. I think there will be some combinations of it out there because of people chasing that. But I think we can
think that see at the turns, it is one area where your teams mightn't be as unique, particularly in the first few rounds, because the likes of Harrison falling 2 or 3 picks, so he would go at the 203 and we get Puka going at the 110. It's going to be quite correlated, and obviously, or not, but it's going to be a more often done kind of combination than you would expect. The other part is we'll see how the draft progresses, but there's another Arizona Cardinal that I like, but we could have completely went in on the Cardinals, but I just have Olave, and they're all in the one tier for me there as well.
Yeah, I've got a lot of teams from the 111, 112 where it is heavy on the Cardinals. So yeah, I'm quite happy to just take something different and figure out the correlations as we go later. There's been a couple of interesting picks in this one. Star Kindler taking Kyron Williams at the 204. That's definitely the earliest I've seen him go in a little while, but I like it because it's different with AJ Brown than a lot of teams will have at the minute. Jonathan Taylor falls all the way to the 212 and ends up with CeeDee Lamb and Devonta Smith. We've got a couple of triple wide receiver starts in the middle, and then Zay Flowers goes off ahead of us. We are one pick away. And in terms of ADP, we've got Sam Laporta, Josh Allen, Michael Pittman, Travis Etienne, Pacheco, Tank Dell, Lamar, Trey McBride, Christian Kirk, Mark Andrews. Where we going, Colm?
Well, I think the first pick should be Laporta. What do you think?
I'm fine with that. I haven't taken huge amounts of Laporta, and it's not that I dislike him, but 7 picks past ADP, it just makes too much sense.
And here's the next thing for you. How do you feel about Laporta and McBride, or have you a secondary player you're going to pose to me here?
I had a feeling that you were going to say Laporta and McBride. It's either Tank Dell or Trey McBride for me, and I think I'm kind of okay going with it. And McBride will give us that week 17 correlation with Puka Nacua. So let's do it and see how it turns out, because McBride won't make it back around to us. He does have an ADP of 46. I know you guys over at Rotoviz are quite in on the double elite tight end this year. Do you feel like it's a significant advantage compared to previous years where the bully tight end strategy just hasn't worked that well for the most?
I think it's a case that when we look at the tight ends that are available, so you have, again, looking at next year's draft. So in this draft, Travis Kelce went in the mid-third round, 308, and then we take those two. Sometimes that will put a squeeze now on the tight end position. We'll see more tight ends go before it gets back to us. Now, that might not be the case. There might be no tight ends going up until our next selection. But what I talked about earlier is when you're drafting at the back of the draft, can you chase to catch up with what is available at the front end for those players making those selections? And a way to differentiate yourself is to build out a team construction that may have that advantage. So realistically now, if what happened last year, and I would be expecting that plus more, because, for example, Trey McBride was in competition last year with Zach Ertz for the majority of the start of the season, but you get a full season from him, and you get a full season of Sam Laporta and him taking a step forward in the second year, McBride being more an impact on the offense. That also, we're hoping that Kyler Murray is better this year and is healthier and all that put together. Should be better quarterback play. But what we're trying to do there is to put a squeeze on the other teams that they cannot compete at the tight end position, and potentially then at the flex position as well. But in terms of previous years, the other reason for looking to get two of the kind of premium tight ends, I would call them elite tight ends, but again, I've mentioned this before, running kind of all the way down to Njoku, the Brock Bowers kind of tier there of tight end. I think that once you go beyond that, tight end is there will be some gems in there, but it's pretty much a wasteland. And again, trying to challenge how you can beat the other teams is the reason for it. So I can't say it's definitely going to be successful, but I think that it's a way to attack teams when you're in a certain spot like this. And realistically, I probably wouldn't have wanted to go back to back there. But the way the draft is set up, so the players that went before that, if Zay Flowers is available there, my dream scenario there would have been Zay Flowers and Sam Laporta. Zay Flowers goes at the 309, then DK Metcalf, Josh Allen. But after that, then the players who've gone since are Travis Etienne, Michael Pittman, Tank Dell. Pittman and Dell would have been in conversation for me. T. Higgins goes at the 409, then Pickens, then Hollywood Brown, then Terry McLaurin, then Christian Kirk. Realistically now, this is the spot where Trey McBride would be going, but I would rather have him on the roster player for player over pretty much all of those names that have gone since. And that's the way I would look at that.
Yeah, and I would say I'm not as in on the double elite tight end builds, but for me, if it ends up being 4-5% of my portfolio across the season, then I'm quite happy with that. If this is your first time here watching us on this channel, do hit the subscribe button. Mondays, Underdog Drafts. We've got John from the Badge Bros with us this Monday. We've got John Daigle from Establish a Run on our Wednesday Draftkings show. Ian Hart, it's the week after, and then Pete Overzet for an Underdog Draft the week after. So lots going on. Going back to you, Colm, how happy would you be? What percentage of your portfolio would you be happy with a double tight end build like that?
Well, to be honest, so far through those opening 9 rounds, I would say when I'm talking about the tight ends, having 2 of them through 9, I would guess that it's in the 80% range at this point, which is obviously drastically high. But the factor with that is too, a bit like your exposures throughout the course of the season, that will balance out. There'll be drafts where you miss out on both of those guys, some of those guys. Like if Sam Laporta went where Kelsey went, I don't think I would have been drafting Kelsey. I'm not really in on him at price this year. And then that means that you would take maybe McBride in that situation. So then it depends how the rest of the draft falls and if you end up getting 2 of those guys. So just with natural draft playing out, I think it's a case that that'll balance itself over time. But I'm expecting it to still be above, even being conservative, probably the 40%. And then depending on the format that we're playing in, that like for example, we took those 2 tight ends. There's 3 tight ends have gone in the last 6 picks there. So things can change now. And that again, there's going to be people without a tight end who will start to be like, I don't want to get boxed out a tight end here. Then if they don't, they're going to have to take 3 or 4 tight ends later in the draft. That's going to free up other players to fall to us. So it's basically opportunity cost of the players that were available there versus the players who are going to be available later. Do you want to take a Cole Kmet later, or do you want to take one of the 0 RB running backs? It's all about trying to balance that out. Think of it now when we finish the draft at the end. Which players would you have changed in that round swing for McBride, for example, and how your team would look different then if you take a tight end from round 12 and switch it around?
Yeah, so we're back on the clock. Two wide receivers, 2 tight ends, Calvin Ridley, Chris Godwin, Keon Coleman, Xavier Worthy, DeAndre Hopkins.
Xavier Worthy would be my pick. Do you have a different pick?
No, Xavier Worthy's the player who I've been trying to draft a little bit more of lately, so I'm good with that. Do you think we want another wide receiver after that? I'd be fine with Chris Godwin or possibly even Keon Coleman.
I'm not too pushed. Show me the flex position just if you can. Don't draft DeAndre Hopkins, did you? I think you did. No, we're still on the clock. Did you? Yeah.
It auto clicked me.
We'll let you away with it this time. That's my one share of DeAndre
Hopkins.
No,
what happened there was the clock ran out as I hovered over Xavier Worthy, and then I just, as it changed and moved DeAndre Hopkins up, it moved DeAndre Hopkins up. But I'm okay with that because, as I've been making a point of lately, I don't understand why DeAndre Hopkins is going behind Calvin Ridley. You look at virtually every major stat, like yards per route run, yards per game, fantasy points per touch, and DeAndre Hopkins was outscoring Calvin Ridley. He's got a pre-existing relationship with Will Levis, and I'm just not at all worried about Hopkins, whereas I definitely see a world where Calvin Ridley fails again. So he might not be your favorite pick, but yeah, I'll just squeeze that one in there.
Let's go back to the players and go to the flex just to see which options could have been in the conversation. I didn't have a strong option, and the option that I had is maybe gets back to us. So yeah, I'm not overly concerned by that selection. You could have thought about Kenneth Walker, for example. I've mentioned this a lot of times. He's my first real, do we take a running back here in a 0 RB build? But I think, again, with the 2 elite tight ends, you do want to make sure you're still getting those wide receivers. And, Keon Coleman's probably the upside play. I talked earlier about, where players are getting drafted next year. The likelihood of DeAndre Hopkins going up the way is not high, but the other part is you mentioned some of the numbers from last season. Sean and Ben did a Stealing Bananas episode this week talking about the Titans. And like you said, a lot of the numbers are much more favorable to Hopkins. So the player I would have selected was Jordan Addison. He is just gone off the board. If we had time to think it through, you mentioned Coleman being an option. Would you take Coleman over Addison? Obviously, there's a fairly significant ADP gap.
I would have veered towards Coleman just because of the reach we put on McBride, taking him half a round early. Like generally, when I've taken a player that early, I start becoming a bit conservative with where I'm taking players after that. So yeah, I do like Jordan Addison, and I think that people are ragging on him a little too much at the minute. I think that when you take out TJ Hawkinson of this offense and you're talking about a second-year player, he can absolutely be more consistent than he was last year. So yeah, another draft Jordan Addison would have done.
And for people who are, we talked earlier about the challenges of drafting at the turn when you're doing a stream. Well, that was one of the challenges. You may select DeAndre Hopkins, but I think in terms of a 6th round value, I think it's a safe floor play. But like I'm not. If you look at this tier, I'm not completely against it, but I would be looking to take Addison and Coleman over him. But outside of that, the players who have gone since, it's not all that outlandish. So we are 7 picks away. We have 4 wide receivers. We have 2 tight ends, and that's the other thing. With somebody like a Hopkins as your wide receiver 4, it's much different than if you've gone with a hero RB build, and then maybe have taken the tight end, and he ends up, if you take an elite quarterback, could be your wide receiver 2 or 3. So
yeah,
you
absolutely.
just have to make up for it now with these next 2 picks. We need some fallen superb wide receiver ADP values to make up for that misclick.
So Phil's almost on the clock. First time I've taken Kelsey Mahomes, as Kelsey fell a bit, chasing wide receiver now. Since that pick, he's added Jaden Reed and Chris Godwin. So kind of on track, 3 wide receivers through 6 rounds is about the bare minimum. Starkinless in, naked Stroud, right on cue after he'd set up a Zay Flowers Tank Dell correlation and then pivoted into Anthony Richardson. In terms of where we're at, we've still got a couple of these guys in the draft, in the chat with us right now. So let's not be revealing all our favorite secrets, but the players kind of around where we're at. We've got a running back, David Montgomery, DeAndre Swift, James Conner, and then Ramondre Stevenson, who I've been trying to draft a little bit more of lately, Zach Moss, Raheem Mostert. At wide receiver, Jameson Williams, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Curtis Samuel, but you start getting into the pick 100, and we're only at pick 85 here, so might not need to reach quite that far down to Curtis Samuel territory. And then tight end, I don't think we're going to need any more, but I'll just show you them.
Just tight end, just so I can see the names. Just so I can get excited.
So Jameson Williams goes. So if we did want a wide receiver for me, it'd be Jackson Smith and Jigba, 1 pick away. And then at running back,
go to quarterback there, because we do have Kyler Murray would be an option. 3 picks past ADP if you wanted to look at a quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine on Kyler Murray. I thought you weren't in on Kyler Murray, but
I think we drafted him the last time together as well. But I think when we're going this direction, and he's just added Joe Burrow's well past ADP, which is interesting. But I think we go Murray and then a wide receiver. What do you think?
Yeah, Murray and JSN works for me.
Is there any priority over JSN? Go to the flex again for me.
Yeah, I mean,
Ramondre here if you wanted. You could go Ramondre if you really want to, but
I'll take Mostert because I'm fine on him. I wrote up a piece this week saying that I thought that Raheem Mostert was being undervalued. I think this is kind of like the edge of a tier of running backs where I really want to be taking shots. I've started putting together a video about this kind of area in the drafts where once you get past pick 73 in drafts, it's been fantastic for running backs over the course of the next 2-3 rounds over the last 3 years. And I think there's some really good values year to year. I don't think Raheem Mostert should be going, even say in round 4, but the gap between where he and Achan is, it's massive. And I think that, if Mostert was in the 7th round or, even the back end of the 6th round, I'd still feel comfortable taking him. So very much fine with that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And again, it would be more players available at the same position, at a different position in the 6th round, for example. But Mostert, you mentioned Stevenson. He was somebody I was very heavily in on last season. When we look down through, you mentioned though Kyler Murray, and Murray is the sort of player I don't want to be completely out on because I'm obviously so in on McBride. And with Murray, like if he comes back and he's kind of not very good, well, that's all fine. But if Murray again comes back and shows some of the stuff that he did early in his career, he's a sort of player as well that could be in that 5th round with CJ Stroud next year, for example. So that would be the factor. Like there's certain players that I'm not drafting at all, but there's other players where if you're at ADP like we were there and you can stack him with McBride, but you also have not a huge amount of other priorities at that point in the draft, I think it makes sense there when all those boxes are ticked.
Yeah, and Kyler, even when coming back from the ACL injury last year, was still rushing for 5.6 attempts per game. He was still throwing for a reasonable amount. And I think the video I did looking at how pocket passers compete with dual threats, basically if you're rushing 5 times a game, and if you're throwing for over 240 passing yards and 1.8 touchdowns per game, you're going to be up there. And Kyler Murray just has a habit of being close on a lot of those things. So I'm not all the way in. I think there's still some issues with that offense. Projecting Marvin Harrison to be elite from day one is a scary idea. But I think.
But if Marvin Harrison is elite, and then Trey McBride is the tight end too, pretty much,
Yep. As Rich says, hit the like button. We've got 23 viewers here on YouTube, lots more on Twitter. Come over to YouTube and hit that like button. Joe Burrow did go at the 807. Couple of picks away from Ben Heyman, who's here in the chat with us, who had Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Feel free on that one, but he did get Brock Purdy to go with his Niners stack he's set up. So, yeah. Colm, how are you feeling about his team through 8 rounds? We've got Puka Nacua, Chris Olave, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, Xavier Worthy, DeAndre Hopkins on your choice, Kyler Murray, and Raheem Mostert.
We're looking pretty good, and we're looking, I think, relatively unique with the 2 tight ends back to back there. I think we'll have a lot more of an outcome of what this team is like when we go through the entire draft. Obviously, there's a lot of pieces left to put together, but having Kyler Murray there as well gives some flexibility with these next rounds. Like, we can take a second quarterback in the window here if we want, the QB window, but we can also push it to much later situations. We took Olave. Obviously, there's some not very attractive options like a Derek Carr, but we could push it all out and bet into 2 quarterbacks in this build as well. So there's a lot of ways we can play it here to see what goes through the next couple of rounds. The other player I would have taken ahead of Mostert, I was between him and JSN. And with that in mind, JSN went 2 picks after we did. So that's another reference point I think I'll look back at as the draft progresses, as maybe that was somewhere we could have got an additional wide receiver. But depending again how the running back position plays out, we could get into we could be very grateful of having Mostert at that particular point of the draft as well. So we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, 0 running back through 7 rounds. I'm not sure, given the value in rounds 7 to 10, I'm not sure we need to push it further every time. I would have been fine with JSN, but I did like your shout of Raheem Mostert.
There is a lot in it. Like, Warren went in that round. We've talked about him being one of our favorite guys. So there's a lot of guys in that range that we're intrigued by and looking at. And there's a few names coming up here where there's a chance I think we could be back-to-back running backs here as well. So we'll see how it sets up. Quite a few interesting names here, but we're 1 pick away, so we'll keep it on the down low, and then we'll head up some of the potential options. But I think that then starts to make the team look a lot different at this particular point. So we are on the clock. Multiple names that would be of interest here would be Spears, who you've tagged in the queue. Trey Benson would be intriguing to me at this particular point as well. And the other one, I don't know if you're in on or not, but Devin Singletary. I see it looks like you've 20%. So yeah. So I would take 2 of those guys. It depends if we want to put Benson, and I would go Spears first anyway.
Yeah, so Spears is the auto click for me. I've been wanting to get more exposure. I feel really good about his price point. I think that he's going to rise up draft boards over next month. I have been taking
here with Benson. Sorry to interrupt you. Is do we want to cut into some of the Kyler Murray rushing touchdowns, or do we want to go it's between him and Devin Singletary here for me? So,
well, I'm coin flip. So go on, you shout Trey Benson or Singletary.
Singletary.
Yeah, I like stacking running backs with the quarterbacks a bit more now than I did a few years ago. But I think adding that kind of passing, when you've got the passing game and you've got Trey McBride, I'm happy to just lean into that narrative. And if Benson was way past ADP or something, it would have been easy click. But yeah, I am quite bullish on Devin Singletary, like you say, sitting at 20% exposure, and that's a number which I would probably look to bring down to about 15% as drafting season goes on. But I'm not buying the Tyrone Tracy hype. I'm not buying the Eric Gray eating into Singletary's workload. I did a draft with Justin Herzig on this channel on Wednesday, and we talked about the same thing. It's the ideal situation would be that Tyrone Tracy turns into nothing because Eric Gray isn't going to steal touches from Devin Singletary, a player who had 19 touches per game from week 10 onwards last year. So, yeah, feeling pretty good about it.
the big thing with like those sort of narratives, there will be truth to some of them. There won't be truth to others. But the other part to consider, and another thing that I talk about a lot, is like outside of, let's say, Christian McCaffrey, and I would say Breece Hall, maybe let's go to as far as Robinson, but every other backfield is going to be some way split. Two possibly, but a lot of the time three in those backfields. Like, we're talking about Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears, but there is going to be games where there's other running backs involved for the Titans. It's not just going to be like 10 carries each. There's going to be somebody else getting 3 carries. And you're like, well, that's a waste of time. But the teams are going to split the carries up. So in that case, Gray could have 2 carries. We could see Tracy have 4 carries. We could see Singletary have 14 carries. It'll all work out. So we'll see how that plays out. But Singletary, I think, kind of showed a lot down the stretch last year, and has always been somebody I've had a soft spot for since his time with the Buffalo Bills. So we have a young running back, 2 very veteran running backs, 1 very veteran wide receiver, but the rest of them are all set up pretty nicely. But the other thing I would point out on the Kyler Murray pick that you were talking about is, like, if those things click, he's been drafted way too late. The other part then, you mentioned with the running back, if we had taken Trey Benson, you could have him doing some short dump offs that are then carried in as receiving touchdown Trey Benson, and both players get the points from that, obviously, which would be fantastic. But realistically, what you're probably looking for is, if you're inside the 5-yard line, that Murray's going to take it himself, or you're looking for one of the pass catching options like a Trey McBride or a Marvin Harrison. So it can work out, but I like to differentiate the potential scoring points at certain points of the draft, and that's why I went for Singletary there.
Yeah, we're just checking on the chat. Ben saying SS Styles did me dirty when he took Burrow 2 picks before him. But yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry to Ben. The first thing when you said about where Burrow went, because we obviously passed on him, was when you said Burrow went at the 807. My first thought was, I hope he didn't go to a Bengals drafter. So sorry about that. That was my first thought. Like, you don't want other drafters getting ADP values that set them up with insane stacks.
Yeah, and then the league saying we all had to pivot at QB at the front end of a draft. I'm okay with Packers though. Nice little Christian Watson, Jordan Love, Romeo Dubs, Dontavian Wicks stack from the 102. So definitely leaning heavy into that young Packers offense, which I know Colm won't have any problem with being a Packers fan. You think they can kick on a gear this year?
Yeah, I'm quite excited. It's one of them things. Last year there wasn't huge expectations, but it was the first season in a long time where, like, it wasn't kind of, oh, we need to make the Super Bowl this year. It was kind of like, whatever happens, happens. And it turned out to be one of the most enjoyable seasons in a long, long time. But also, like, the feeling of like a team that is now on the crest of a wave. So I mentioned Kai Havertz at the start of the show. I'm an Arsenal supporter, and they're another team who are kind of, while not getting there and winning the Premier League, they're on the up in terms of a team ascending, young players all together. And it feels like the Packers are in a similar mold. Will they win anything? That's tough to see. But there is a chance that Jordan Love is basically CJ Stroud, and that these guys are all ready to go.
Yeah, honestly, those seasons where you play with house money, it doesn't matter what sport you're in. It's just, there's nothing quite like that. Like the 2019 Ravens season, the Ravens hadn't been bad, but under Flacco, it never felt particularly fun. That season was one of the most fun years of following any team I've had. Like, being a Preston North End fan over here, there's plenty of seasons where they've just been, you didn't expect anything out of them, and then they pushed into the playoffs, and it was a lot of fun. We are 1 pick away, 1-3-4-2 currently. Nick Chubb falling 14 spots past ADP, Zeke Elliott near the top, Jerry Jeudy, Kirk Cousins, Cole Kmet, Matthew Stafford, which we could stack with Puka Nacua to give us our second quarterback if you feel like he's in the window, and then down to like Jahan Dotson, Rico Dowdle, Josh Downs.
Yeah, Jerry Jeudy was going to be the pick. He just went. With 15 seconds, I'll let you. Have you a strong priority here?
I'd like to stack Stafford. I know they're both in the same week 17 game. But I don't worry about that. And then outside of that, running back, I don't mind Kendre Miller. I've been drafting a bit more of him. At wide receiver, Josh Downs would give us some week 16 and 17 correlation against the Titans and the Giants. But outside of that, there's nobody I'd like to make a case for. How about you?
Yeah, they're kind of the two names as well. Let's go. I feel like we're going to get squeezed a little bit at wide receiver, but I feel like running back is probably the pick with Miller. But I think we need to go wide receiver here. So let's take Downs.
Yeah, I think by the time it comes back around, then all of a sudden you end up in the real rookie range where you're looking at the
Yeah.
likes of Burton, Roman Wilson, and all of a sudden, those are guys we probably still want to consider, but I think there'll be a little bit of running back value that might fall to us, saying that Kendre Miller and Marshawn Lloyd go off the board very quickly. TJ Hawkinson, I'd said that I was going to be out on TJ Hawkinson until he got to at least the 140 range of drafts because it just felt like that's where he should be going. Same with Nick Chubb, injured players who could be ineffective or miss chunk of time. I don't want to draft them before that range. Now we're starting to see those guys fall to this range. Are you more open to drafting those two?
Yeah, Chubb was going to be the pick if we didn't need to go wide receiver. I feel construction wise, we had to go wide receiver there, which is not usually the way we want to be in these drafts. You want to have that flexibility to pick up those values, but that's another challenge with drafting at the edge there of the draft where you're picking back to back, and that kind of we got a little bit squeezed there. What I would like, and interestingly, he has continued to fall. Hasn't been selected since that. I think you're looking at the injury coming back from it, but when healthy, and if he was to come back healthy, and you're building out a zero RB roster, for example, the upside there is just monstrous. But yeah, still hasn't been drafted since that point. Who knows? Maybe he gets back to us. There'll be 100 picks after ADP. What I would like to do there was go Jerry Jeudy, Matthew Stafford. Jerry Jeudy won one pick before, and the other player, we took Downs there, and he's not somebody I'm really drafting. I'm taking Adonai Mitchell, who went 3 picks before our selection. So that went from a situation where I was feeling quite comfortable with how we were going to have options there to the options got really welled up. And that's where if you're drafting in, say, spot 7, you could take Mitchell there, you could take Jeudy there, and then see how it plays out through the rest of the round, for example. But yeah, that was a little bit, and that's where it's going to be interesting to look at this draft after is the challenges, because when you do draft at the turn, you can really see the specific players that you could change in or out. And a lot of the time, like so far in this draft, there's not a lot I would change out. The one that's going to be interesting is when we look back at potential tight end swapping places, what we could potentially have done there. But I think at the end we'll still be very comfortable with the way we played that out. So we are 7 picks away. But how are you feeling? I guess that's the question, because I know I'm comfortable with what we've done, but I don't know. Sometimes it can be tricky.
Yeah, so I think sometimes with zero RB or even hero RB builds, it's that when you start hammering the running back position, do you start getting left behind at other positions? We talk about that at the top end of a draft so often, and not when I get left behind at wide receiver. But it's almost like if you get lost on wide receiver in this range as well, it can kind of hurt. So taking Josh Downs felt pretty good. He's going to be out there in 2 wide receiver sets. I think that he's going to be a useful player on what can be a fun, fast-paced offense. So whilst our running back room isn't necessarily the best it could be, I think we're still going to be able to make it work. And likewise, I would have said Jerry Jeudy and Matt Stafford, I would have taken over Josh Downs. I would have been fine with that. But otherwise, I'm kind of fine with it. There's still
I have to say the running back room I'm extremely comfortable with. I think that's stronger than I like. People look at single, like I'm not on projected volume, but I think other people would be more comfortable with that than some of the trio of running backs that we would have selected.
Yeah, so we're back on the clock. Antonio Gibson, J.K. Dobbins, Jalen Wright, Chuba Hubbard, Tyler Algier, all within range. I feel like we need at least one running back here, Colm.
Do you?
Well, I'm happy to push it. And your boy Wandale's right at the top. Roman Wilson, Rashad Bateman.
Let's go. Let's go for Franklin. Can you get him?
Yeah. Okay, so we've got.
I would be of the mindset here to go wide receiver. But do you want to make it?
So let's see. Roman Wilson would give us a bit of week 17 correlation with Xavier Worthy, or Wandale with Josh Downs. So I'm kind of fine with either of them because I like taking those picks for that. Any shout between Wandale and Roman?
Well, I prefer Wandale, but I'm okay. We have a lot of week 11 actually. Let's go for Roman. I was going to say let's go for Roman Wilson. We have a lot of week 11 players.
So I went with Wandale simply because I've been drafting Roman Wilson quite a bit on my own team. So when I draft with you and you like Wandale, it helps me smooth out some of those exposures. We do have what
we only
in
have
terms of
4.
wide
We just have
yeah,
Cardinals, and it felt like more when we were making that pick. So that's
and
okay.
it's the only
Just-
wide receiver on a week 11 bye.
Just go back to the running backs, because this is the fun part again where you don't have time to flip between. But show us the running backs that were available, because I'm like, Wright would be normally the pick there, but we have already bought in. I don't really want a second piece. Then J.K. Dobbins is somebody who I would like to add to some rosters, but he could fall. You have Vidal, who might, there's a couple of names here that are, could come back to us. And that's why I feel like we needed to amp up the wide receivers.
Yeah, I mean, basically, when you look in this range, there's 3 or 4 names that I'd be comfortable taking next time we get around. So, yeah, I mean, in the chat saying Dobbins is getting cut. Dobbins' contract is absolutely cuttable. I think that's definitely possible. But I also think that there's a very realistic scenario where the Chargers are quite happy to roll him out there because he's not costing them any money. What do the Chargers even want to do this year? Everyone keeps saying they should trade for Dameon Pierce, but why? What are the Chargers doing? They're cleaning up their cap. They're definitely building for next year and beyond. And I know Jim Harbaugh. Yeah, Jim Harbaugh, yes, he's not going to want to lose games, but I don't think there's any difference between having a guy like J.K. Dobbins out there, and Vidal might be a younger player and might be, have a far, far cleaner injury history. But if he can't play the guitar, then he can't play the guitar. So I'm definitely not all the way in on that. So yeah, in terms of this draft, though, going 7 wide receivers by that point, I would have, if I was drafting on my own, probably gone running back, wide receiver. But I'm okay pushing it because I feel like overall, there's still running backs alike. I think as long as Raheem Mostert and Devin Singletary do what we need them to do in this build, then we can kind of push it a bit more. And having listened to
your the running back that you would have taken there? Is it one of them names that have gone already?
Yeah, I would have taken Jalen Wright or Tyler Algier. I think.
And would you have taken Wright with Mostert? That's the reason I would. If it was a case that we hadn't Mostert, I would have taken Wright, and I would have seen if we could push Robinson to the next turn. But because of the way we set up there,
yeah, I've got no problem with taking Wright and Mostert on the same team. I think in that kind of mindset, you're saying, okay, well, Devon Achane continues to get injured in the way that he did last year. Barely played over 40% of snaps in a majority of the games that he played. And as electric as he is, if he continues picking up injuries, do we end up having a 1-2 tandem of Wright and Mostert? Well, that could work. I'm okay with that. But yeah, I definitely get that point. I'm a little more open to those kind of duos on the same team this year than I have been in previous years.
So based on the structure, I know I kind of probably put you a little bit outside of the sync with the 2 tight ends, but at this point you probably would have 2 tight ends through 14. So you would be ideally at this point 4 wide receivers, 4 running backs, 6 wide receivers. Is that you'd be more comfortable?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I definitely have teams where I'm still at 3 running backs by this point. It's just maybe did I go running back round 7 and then maybe 2 more by the time I get to round 11. But
we did draft running back at the 7-13, if that makes you more comfortable.
I mean, I'm always comfortable getting uncomfortable in the draft rooms. And I know you are, having listened to your pod with Sean this week where you drafted in the Superflex on underdog and really pushed your quarterbacks. But we're a couple of picks away. There is J.K. Dobbins, Tyrone Tracy, Khalil Herbert, Dameon Pierce at the top of the running backs, down to Braylon Allen, who's starting to rise up. You can see he's up by 13 spots in the last 7 days, so he's definitely creeping up. At wide receiver, we're probably in a good spot, but let me just show. We've got Luke McCaffrey, Zay Jones, Demario Douglas, Demarcus Robinson. We maybe still need one more, but it's probably not a priority. And if you wanted a quarterback, there is Will Levis, who we could stack. He's fallen.
No. Not no, isn't, but I don't think we need him here. I would probably go with Dobbins at this pick.
This is the thing with Dobbins and why I didn't want to take him on the last one, because he falls. So we're getting 23 spots of ADP on him, and I've seen him fall this kind of range often. So yeah, Dobbins works for me.
Yeah, and then just on the next pick, what I would be looking at here is see if we go through the running backs. A lot of these guys are potentially in that next pick zone. So it's up to you if you want to push it, but I would go. I would be interested here just for the stacking purposes with Zay Jones. If you're interested in that, he's obviously with the Cardinals now. He's top of the wide receiver board by ADP.
Yeah,
how
I'm
do you feel
fine with
about
that. I've taken a little bit of Zay Jones. I think, he's a good wide receiver. He could definitely fill a role within that team. And if they go up tempo, he's the kind of player who could feed into that. So I'm okay with that. And now with a 2-4-8-2, we should be done at wide receiver most likely. We've got Puka
You're saying that,
Nacua.
is that a thing you're saying to me just to make sure that I hear it, or?
No, I mean, well, round 16. Well, it kind of depends what we do at quarterback, which is another conversation. But we've got Puka Nacua, Chris Olave, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, Xavier Worthy, DeAndre Hopkins, Kyler Murray, Raheem Mostert, Tajay Spears, Devin Singletary, Matthew Stafford, Josh Downs, Troy Franklin, Wan'Dale Robinson, J.K. Dobbins, and Zay Jones. So we have 4 picks left we can make, and we have a 2-4-8-2. Maybe there's another wide receiver in there to get up to 9. I don't think that's problematic, but I think we're definitely looking at least we have to really get up to 6 running backs with this kind of
there's
build.
2, and I could see us at the next turn being back to back, depending on how it runs. So that, I think 6 is definitely the number we want to get to, potentially even 7. You mentioned there the conversation. So we have 2 tight ends that we took in the first 4 rounds, I believe it was. So we have a conversation around tight end and quarterback. So it's 2 and 2 at the moment. We talked about, 3 possibly of both of those positions being advantageous in this particular format. But with a team like this, I'm okay if it was 2 and 2, because we have 2, in my opinion, legitimate starters that without injury are remaining the starters the rest of the season at quarterback, but also at tight end, both with different bye weeks. So if we get an opportunity as the draft progresses here, I'm okay with going with those. But realistically, I do feel like when you invest in the 2 tight ends, for example, unless something really pops up for you, I think you're set at a 2 tight end build to kind of give yourself again a positional structural advantage to fill in one of the, you're kind of trying to do something different to compete with those other teams again, like I mentioned at the start of the show.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a question in the chat from Index of Suspicion, who wants to know what are your thoughts on the New York Giants tight end room. I'm not advocating drafting them. For me,
I had been all off season that Darren Waller was definitely going to retire. That was my thesis. Darren Waller was 100% going to retire. And myself and Sean did a listener league on the Sunday before he announced his retirement, and we had drafted Daniel Jones, and we were I said, if we didn't draft him and this, he had a great season and this team could have won $100,000 if we drafted Darren Waller. So that was the way that we ended up drafting him. But then he did retire. So he was and the player that I do like is Daniel Bellinger, but the news has not been positive. So then you have the rookie in there as well. It's just a muddled area. But again, if you have the two tight ends that we've drafted, you don't really have to think about that at the back end of the draft either. Kind of into that conversation earlier. But yeah, Bellinger would probably be my pick. But they're guys that are pretty much going free then in these drafts.
Yeah, I've taken slightly more Bellinger just because it just seems like more people are out on him. And if I'm getting one player towards the end of the draft, it feels like rookie fever will pull Theo Johnson up a little bit. And if that means that I get a player like Daniel Bellinger who is less rostered, then I'm okay with taking that dart throw. Will Levis goes off the board like 3 picks before us. He had fallen a long way, sort of way past his ADP of 168 down to the 200s. I would have made a case to draft him as our 3rd quarterback, even though we didn't particularly need him. We're back on the clock, and running back, Damian Pierce, Roshan Johnson, Keaton Mitchell, Donta Foreman, CEH, Will Shipley, who we draft every week.
Yep.
And Alexander Mattison. So Will Shipley's going to be one of them, right, Colm?
Yeah. That was the player I passed at the last round for. And, it is a little bit ahead of ADP, but I like to get him on the roster. Have you a name there that you have a strong preference for in this? What's the outlook on Keaton Mitchell's return to health here? Somebody who I loved last year.
I don't think we're going to see him too early, but I think if you can get him down the stretch as a really explosive player, I'm fine with that.
The reason I would say that is, like, if you look at this, and I know people will say it's like not a great running back room. Do you have a different take you want before I go into this in case we run out of time?
No, I was just going to say, like, Keaton Mitchell for me, when it drafts opened and you were talking pick 180, 170, I wasn't interested, but here, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, so we've added potentially 2 running backs to a 0 RB team that will not play this year, and Keaton Mitchell and J.K. Dobbins. But when you look at it, the 3 guys that we took at the start, the concern with a Singletary is that he starts the season and doesn't play well and then loses work. But the part of that it gives you a little bit of an edge in this team is, like, if it takes Shipley time to get some extra work with Saquon Barkley there, or maybe he doesn't get any work at the start, or maybe Keaton Mitchell has to work back to health, or J.K. Dobbins has to find his stride. Those players, the 3 players that we drafted early, are going to give you the points at the start of the season. These players you have the ability to let come along. So if I had taken some players who had to kind of work their way into a starting job in those 0 RB picks, up to round 10, sometimes the Keaton Mitchell pick or the Dobbins pick would be ones that I might not be going for. A lot of the time here, I'm going for, like, rookie running back upside. But yeah, if you get a case that it's week 14 and Mitchell is starting to come in like he was at the end of last season, you suddenly have an absolute league-winning player at that point, even with a Derrick Henry there, for example.
Yeah, and, like, you look at the Ravens had a bye in week 14. Even if we got virtually nothing from Keaton Mitchell before that point, if you were telling me, okay, in week 15, 16, 17, I can get a player who rushed for, like, well over 6 yards per carry, was explosive in both passing and the rushing game, I think it's worth a sprinkle. Again, it's not a player I'm going to be overly heavy on, as Rich says in the chat. Shock Tom interested in a Ravens player. I mean, look, it was
be
either
honest, that's the only reason we drafted J.K. Dobbins either, is that he's a former Raven.
J.K. Dobbins, I haven't taken him at ADP a single time this season, but I'll scoop J.K. Dobbins because the range on him is massive. I did a draft with Eric Beinfor where we got him 50 spots past ADP.
Okay.
I had a draft with somebody else, Andrew Erickson, maybe, where we scooped him up 35 spots past ADP. And when you're talking about what makes good best ball teams year over year, you just do end up seeing that the teams that scooped a bit of value ends up working. So yeah, I'm fully aware that there's a part of me that longs for J.K. Dobbins to be remotely healthy and break some long runs and look like the kind of player that we all hoped he would be. But yeah, I definitely came into this year not expecting to draft a lot of J.K. Dobbins, and I still think that I will be underweight when all is said and done and the slate locks in September. So we got 2 picks left to go. 2682 with Puka Nacua, Chris Olave, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, Xavier Worthy, DeAndre Hopkins, Kyler Murray, Raheem Mostert, Tajay Spears, Devin Singletary, Matthew Stafford, Josh Downs, Troy Franklin, Wan'Dale Robinson, J.K. Dobbins, Zay Jones, Will Shipley, and Keaton Mitchell. The room definitely made a decision for us in terms of quarterbacks, because now when you look at the guys who are left, it is Bo Nix, who's fallen 20 picks past ADP, Russell Wilson, who's gone 20 picks past ADP almost, and then Gardner Minshew before you get down into the backups and the real question marks. Are you any interest in taking any of those guys if they fell to us, or just want to stay with the 2 quarterbacks we've got because of the reasons we've kind of already covered?
I think it becomes a discussion. Like, Nix is somebody who I've drafted more than probably most people would want to draft, but I have been drafting their wide receivers, the likes of Mims, and in this draft, obviously, we have drafted Franklin, drafting Bo Nix along with that. Haven't been drafting any Russell Wilson. I've been drafting Justin Fields. The Minshew versus O'Connell one's quite interesting. Obviously, their ADPs right beside each other. I've kind of been given a little bit of an edge there to O'Connell in that one. I've drafted him a couple of times. But I'm okay if there's better players available at running back, wide receiver, or even tight end to go that direction. And that's like obviously a strong take that there will be. Go to the flex, Tom, if you can. We're 1 pick away.
Yeah, Jalen Tolbert feels fine, gives a bit of correlation. Jalen Hyatt, Kendrick Bourne. Tucker Craft, I don't mind. I think he's, definitely an interest. But yeah,
There's
otherwise
not a
it's
lot,
quite.
so I think we could go quarterback here with the first pick if you want it. There
Yeah,
isn't a lot, so I would be okay with Bo Nix.
yeah,
He's
Bo Nix
probably
would
my
work
pick out
for
of
me.
this group. Have you?
No, I'd go Bo Nix. I think Russell Wilson gives us correlation across all 3 weeks, but I just don't expect
He's
him to
not
be
going to be playing.
starting by that point. Yeah. So running back, it's AJ Dillon, Louis Rees-Zammit, Kareem Hunt, Frank Gore, Dalvin Cook. It just gets real messy real quickly. Like,
I don't think there's anything there running back for us.
no, so I think we can go to either a 3-6-9 to a 3-6-8-3.
Hyatt again would be. Who are you going to say?
I like Jalen Tolbert, but I'd be fine with
Let's do
Hyatt.
it. Let's do it. Let's do it. I'll let you pick this one.
Yeah, Jalen Tolbert just feels like the kind of player who's going to start picking up steam. The Cowboys have said they feel like he can have a good season. You look back at last year and he was outplaying Michael Gallup in a lot of stats over the course of the second half of the season when the Cowboys offense really kicked into gear. So I quite like it. It gives us a little correlation. We finish up with a 3-6-9-2, a Puka Nacua, Chris Olave, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, Xavier Worthy, DeAndre Hopkins, Kyler Murray, Raheem Mostert, Tajay Spears, Devin Singletary, Matthew Stafford, Josh Downs, Troy Franklin, Wandale Robinson, J.K. Dobbins, Zay Jones, Will Shipley, Keaton Mitchell, Bo Nix is our third quarterback, and Jalen Tolbert. Plenty of correlations, as you can see over here on all the teams who are highlighted green. Colm, how are you feeling about it? When we go back and look at that double tight end start now, do you feel like it worked itself out nicely?
Well, basically, the roster that we would put together if we hadn't done that would probably be 3 tight ends, 8 wide receivers. So that's really only the change that you would make there at that particular point. So the conversation then that I was kind of touching on earlier is, do we go ahead and pass on Trey McBride and take one of the players that went between him? And then where do we pick up our additional tight ends? So Trey McBride, I mentioned this earlier, but Etienne, Pittman, Dell, Mahomes, Hurts, Jackson, Pacheco, Higgins, Pickens, Brown, Terry McLaurin, Christian Kirk, Cooper, Kincaid, Cook, Mark Andrews, Josh Jacobs, Keenan Allen, Reed, Pitts, Rashad White, CJ Stroud, and then we're back at Worthy. Like, out of those names, most of the players that I'm most intrigued by are going to be the tight ends that are drafted in between. And the other player that I would have been looking at there potentially would have been Worthy. So I feel like taking those 2 players there and then being able to move into the other players later. Like, if we had Laporta, I would have been kind of hoping that we would get our tight end before Njoku, the second tight end. So he goes in the 806, which would have meant when we take Kyler Murray Mostert, we would have had to pass on one of those. Like, if you look through the rest of the draft, the likes of George Kittle didn't get anywhere near us. I mentioned already Kincaid, Andrews, and Pitts. They all went before our pick. And then after we obviously took our great selection, DeAndre Hopkins, Kittle went at the 609 in that round. Then Evan Ingram went at the 711 before we took Murray at the 712. So it would have changed the outlook of the draft. So really, the only tight end that we could have probably taken would have been Njoku's. We're looking at a decision between Kyler Murray, Mostert, which of those we would cut out for Njoku. So that would be the selection there. And then when we go down through the draft, this was the part that I wanted to like highlight when you're taking those 2 guys. So, I think Pat Freiermuth is an option. Hawkinson is an option, but you kind of already need to have at least one, if not 2 other ones. But I'm not really drafting Schultz. I like Luke Musgrave, but it's a 3 tight end build with Musgrave in it. Cole Kmet went in the 13th round. Otten, Taysom Hill. Then you're into like Sanat, who I do like, but there's a lot of question marks with. You have Hunter Henry, Okonkwo, likely Conklin, Otten. There's a lot of question marks in that zone. Once you go past round 11, there's a lot of question marks. And then you're into, how many do you need? Do you need 3? Do you need 4? Having those additional ones and the elite option, I think, is quite good. Just Star Kindler has 2 tight ends, obviously, was in the draft. Who's Jake Ferguson and who's the second option?
So he
It
went
must be
with
higher. He
Kyle
must go
Pitts.
with Kyle
Yeah,
Pitts.
Kyle Pitts. So Kyle Pitts and Jake Ferguson. And the one pivot I would have considered, like when we're saying away from Trey McBride, would have been if we could have got Michael Pittman and then taken Anthony Richardson around this turn, and then we would have been looking at wide receiver running back in this range. But
The only way that would work for me is if it was Anthony Richardson and Worthy. Like you would Anthony Richardson and
Yeah.
Hopkins would be a pressure. And then so if we did that, that would mean we take Kyler Murray at the 7-12 along with Mostert. So at that point, then you could take JSN and Mostert potentially, or Stevenson or Warren. So there is options to change out the quarterback pick there if that did work. But that is also a very specific route because we take Worthy. I wouldn't mind taking Reed or Allen, but your pathway to getting those names is not the same specifically when you switch them out. But that could have worked as well.
Yeah, and Starkinler says, got sniped on Stroud. Sway Rich was an exposure smooth for me, which makes sense because Stroud going naked there to the team with the 2-5-10-3 build just ahead of us. Yeah. In terms of other people in the draft, we've got Ben saying, fun draft, guys. Good luck. Ben drafted a 3-6-9-2. Obviously, he got sniped as well on Joe Burrow, but he had Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, but he also had Ayuk and Kittle and added Brock Purdy, Brock Bowers in there for the Brock stack, and then adding Justin Herbert, Quentin Johnson later on, Daniel Jones in there as well with Malik
But I
Davis.
do think as well, like he got two tight ends there and Bowers and Kittle, who I would agree are in that top tier for not top tier, but the strategy of elite tight end for me. And it does mean that you can have the flexibility then at other positions. Like I'd be quite happy with that. And there's quite a few teams in this that did actually go with the 2. There's one team that did go with 5. I'm interested if you can show me that was the team in the middle there. If you can show me who all was brought in. So we have Njoku. And then it feels like they must have like went late with a lot of guys after that. So
I think they might have just
likely.
Yeah, I think they must have gone on to auto there because we've got the auto symbol at the top. But like there was definitely maybe there was. I thought that team when I glanced at it during the draft seemed to have thought process. I mean, but then you look back and okay, there's nobody stacked. Hertz is stacked with nobody ahead of him. Goff is stacked with nobody. If you were going to take, really, Caleb Williams should have gone there if you got Swift and Keenan Allen. Instead, they went with Jacoby Myers. So definitely a bit difficult. Got team out of a 5 spot. Legolas saying draft got away from me a bit in the 5 spot. Thankfully, there's some pretty weak teams in here. Yeah, exactly.
He's probably thinking including that team in 12.
So he had Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews after going to Monrad, Devontae Adams, DJ Moore. It's Zamir White, Jalen Warren, Chase Brown, Zach Charbonnet, which is a nice 4 running backs out of 5 rounds there. But yeah, then that JJ McCarthy in terms of the next quarterbacks and taking Aiden O'Connell late to bolster that room. And same with a tight end room of Chigakonkwo and Mark Andrews. So I think he pivoted well enough, really. But
and that again, going back to like the later rounds of some of those drafts we've talked about, that would be again like think if you're work your way back through from the ADP from the 20th round through and like your pivot points of if you don't like I would be interested in people's thoughts, and I'm going to be interested in your thoughts, Tom, over the next week or so as you digest the double tight end at that point as to how that team works out. Sometimes I do these drafts just though as kind of experiments to let them play out. And when you're drafting so much, you like to do things that can be a bit different.
Well, massively so, and particularly you get draft fatigue on the turns. So whenever I'm on the turns, there's an element of going, okay, are these the best players? Is this the best way to approach this turn? But also, how can I make this team stand out? So it's not the double tap at tight end isn't something I find myself doing often, but we've done it in a couple of drafts now. And at the time when we're on the clock and you're like, okay, let's go tight end, there's always a little part of me which is like, ugh. But then when we look back on the team afterwards, I nearly always feel pretty pleased with how we've built it out. And I feel, yeah, this one definitely has stacks of upside. Two stacks as well that I feel good about in Stafford, Puka Nakua, the Kyler Murray, Zay Jones, Trey McBride one. Yes, Zay Jones might be nothing, but I feel good about Trey McBride having a good year 3. So no, overall it felt pretty good to me. Any last thoughts, Colm?
No, I enjoyed the draft. Thanks for everyone watching along. We will be doing this next Tuesday, I believe, over on the Rotoviz YouTube channel, so check that out as well. Lots of content going up over the course of every week over there, as well as obviously here with Tom and the gang. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed watching and hit that thumbs up button.
Yes, indeed. And we will be back on Monday for an underdog draft with John of the Badge Bros. Then on Wednesday next week, John Daigle of Established a Run joins us. Rich is starting to churn out Dynasty content left, right, and center. We've got a couple of new videos coming from him, more strategy videos from myself. Appreciate everyone watching. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. We will be back soon.